Winifred Ashby had exactly 2 ways of surviving supper that night, and both of them meant swallowing something that wasn't food. She was 26 years old, and for 3 winters now she had lived under the roof of Kestrel House, a gray stone place at the edge of Stonebridge that everyone in the district called grand, and no one who had actually stood inside it for more than an hour would ever call warm. The whole town knew what happened behind those windows. The doctor knew, because he had set 2 of her fingers the autumn before last and asked no questions he didn't want answered. The minister knew, because he had married her to Edmund Kestrel in the first place, and had never once, in 3 years, asked her if she was well. The magistrate knew best of all, because Edmund Kestrel held the mortgage on half the county, and a man does not bite the hand that owns his barn. Winifred had stopped waiting for any of them to say something. She had learned the hard way that women in her position always learn things, that the silence of a town is not an absence. It is a wall, built brick by brick out of everyone's small, reasonable cowardice, and by her 3rd winter at Kestrel House, she understood that no one was going to knock it down for her. If it came down, she would have to be the one holding the hammer. This is the story of the winter she picked it up. The general store on Millbank Street smelled of coal oil, wet wool, and the particular cold that a prairie January carries into every building, no matter how many stoves are lit against it. Winifred stood in front of the dry goods shelf with a list in Prudence Fairweather's handwriting pressed flat under her thumb, and a bruise along her collarbone that she had covered that morning with a high-necked blouse, and the same automatic care she brought to dressing every wound nobody was supposed to see. Prudence Fairweather was Edmund's aunt, a narrow woman with a narrower mouth who had run the Kestrel household for 11 years, with the exacting cruelty of someone who had once had nothing and had decided once she finally had something that no one under her roof would ever feel as safe as she once hadn't. The list she'd sent Winifred to town with was ordinary: flour, lamp wick, black thread, a tin of salt, and completely beside the actual point of the errand, which was that Edmund liked knowing his wife could be produced in public on command, cheerful and correctly dressed, proof that whatever was said about the Kestrel marriage in low voices over back fences wasn't true. "That's 20 pounds, said Alden Petrie. From behind the counter, an old man gone soft in the middle with a gray beard and the permanently sorry eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades watching things he wished he hadn't. "Heavy for you to carry alone, Mrs. Kestrel." "I'll manage," Winifred said and reached for it, and that was when the bell over the door rang and a stranger walked into Alden Petrie's store and, without knowing it yet, walked into the exact center of her life. He was tall in the unhurried way of a man who'd never had to make himself bigger to be noticed, wearing a coat of heavy oiled wool built for weather worse than what Stonebridge usually offered, snow still melting off the shoulders of it. He didn't look at her. He looked at the shelves, methodically, the way a man looks who is used to provisioning himself for long stretches, with no one to remind him what he'd forgotten. Winifred noticed him the way she noticed everything now, quickly, quietly, filed away without comment. A habit built out of 3 years of needing to know where every man in a room was standing and what he might do next. It might have ended there, a stranger buying rope and matches and riding back out of town by supper. It didn't, because Edmund Kestrel chose that exact hour to come looking for his wife. He came in loud, the way he always did in public, his voice pitched for an audience even when the store held only 4 people. "There you are," he said, and crossed to her, and took her arm above the elbow in a grip that would leave 4 small bruises, by nightfall, the kind he was careful to place where sleeves would cover them. "You've been gone the better part of an hour. Aunt Prudence will think you've run off. I was only choosing the thread, Edmund." "You were dawdling." His fingers tightened, just slightly, just enough that she felt the old, familiar drop in her stomach, the one that meant the walk home was going to be a quiet one, and the night after it worse. "Come along. You'll want to take your hand off her," the stranger said. He hadn't raised his voice. That was the thing Winifred noticed first, turning to look at him. He'd spoken in the same unhurried register he might have used to ask Alden Petrie the price of rope, and somehow that made it land harder than shouting would have. Edmund Kestrel turned too, drawing himself up to his full and considerable height, the look on his face the one he wore for men who owed him money and hadn't paid it. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. Do you have any notion who I am?" "No," the stranger said, "and I find I don't much care." He hadn't moved from where he stood by the shelf of tinned goods. He didn't need to. "Take your hand off her arm or don't, but if you don't, we're going to have a different kind of conversation, and I don't think you'll enjoy it as much as this one." Edmund Kestrel let go. Not because he was afraid. Winifred would turn that moment over many times in the weeks that followed, and understand that fear had had nothing to do with it, but because a scene in Alden Petrie's store, with a stranger and old Petrie both watching, was not a scene that served him. He let go, straightened his coat, and told his wife to walk home ahead of him, and Winifred did, and the bruises came later that night exactly as she'd known they would, delivered in the private rooms where Stonebridge's collective good manners couldn't reach. She didn't see the stranger again for 6 days. She thought about him more than that. His name, she would learn, was Rourke Ashgrove, and he kept a trapline and a small herd up along the breaks where the prairie folded down into coulee country west of town, close enough to Stonebridge to trade in it twice a season and far enough that he rarely had to. People said different things about him, that he'd come west after something in his past he didn't discuss, that he'd been a scout for the mounted police in the territories before they were provinces, that he simply preferred animals to most people, and had arranged his life accordingly. Winifred didn't know which of it was true. She only knew that on the 7th day, walking the 2 miles from Kestrel House to town, on an errand Prudence Fairweather had invented specifically to keep her moving, keep her occupied, keep her from thinking her own thoughts too long in one place, a blizzard came down off the escarpment with no warning at all. The kind of prairie storm that could take a person's life in the time it took to walk from a barn to a house if the wind was in the wrong mood. She lost the road within 10 minutes. She lost feeling in her hands within 20. She had made her peace, in a distant floating sort of way, with the idea that this might simply be how it ended. Not dramatically, not at Edmund's hand, but quietly, alone in the white, which struck her even then as a strange kind of mercy. When a shape came out of the storm leading a second horse, and a voice she recognized said her name was needed, and did she have one to give him? Ashby, she said, through a jaw gone stiff with cold. Winifred Ashby, not Kestrel. She hadn't called herself that in 3 years. It came out of her like something long buried, finally reaching air. He got her onto the second horse, and got them both to a cabin cut into the side of a coulee, a low, sturdy building built by a man who lived alone in hard country, and had no patience for anything that didn't serve a purpose. She remembered very little of the ride. She remembered the fire once they arrived, and the astonishment of simply being warm, and then nothing at all for the better part of a day. She slept the ragged, interrupted sleep of a body doing emergency repairs rather than resting. She surfaced twice to the sound of wind and once to the sound of the fire settling, and each time sank back under before she'd properly understood where she was. The third time she surfaced, she stayed. The cabin was one room, mostly, split by a rough shelf unit stacked with the practical clutter of a man who lived by his own hands. Traps, coils of rope, tins of preserved meat, a rifle broken down for cleaning on a square of oilcloth, a wood stove, furs on the walls, hung for warmth rather than decoration. Rourke Ashgrove sat at a small table working a strip of leather with a knife, unhurried, the posture of a man well used to his own company. "You're awake," he said without looking up. "How did you know?" Breathing changed. He got up and brought her a tin cup of broth and told her to drink it slowly, and when she tried to push herself upright, her ribs informed her sharply that this was a poor idea. He didn't move to help her. He waited, watching without hovering, while she worked out the mechanics of it herself, which she understood, even in that first foggy hour, to be its own kind of respect. "How many ribs?" she asked, once she'd got the cup steady in both hands. "Couldn't say for certain. 2, maybe 3, by the sound you made turning over. Nothing shifted that shouldn't have, or you'd know it by now. I can't stay still for days." "I have to be," she stopped. She had been about to say home by supper, out of 3 years of pure reflex, and heard how absurd it sounded even before the words arrived. "You have to be nothing," Rourke said. "Not today. Today you have to drink that broth and let your body do what it's already doing, which is mending itself whether you help it along or fight it." She stayed 6 days in that cabin before the storm broke enough to travel, and in those 6 days she learned the particular grammar of a man who did not fill silence out of nervousness. Rourke Ashgrove said little, and what he said was exact, and he never once asked her to perform gratitude or cheerfulness or any of the small emotional labor that had governed every hour of her life at Kestrel House. When she flinched, at a sudden movement, his hand reaching for the kettle, nothing more, he simply stopped and waited, and let her see for herself that nothing was coming. "You don't have to do that," she told him once, on the 4th day, watching him deliberately slow his own movements around her. "Do what? Make yourself smaller. Around me." "I'm not making myself smaller," he said. "I'm only occupying the space I'm actually in." Most men take up more room than that on purpose. Never seemed worth the trouble to me. It was such a small thing to say, and it undid something in her that 3 years of careful survival had held very tightly closed. She cried that night, finally, not from fear but from the strange, disorienting relief of being near someone who wanted nothing from her, and Rourke Ashgrove sat across the small room and let her, and didn't try to fix it, and didn't leave. She told him about Edmund on the 5th night, not because he asked. He never asked, but because the quiet between them had become by then a kind of room she felt safe standing in. She told him about the marriage her father had arranged before he died, believing Edmund Kestrel a solid and prosperous man and never imagining what solid and prosperous could conceal. She told him about Prudence Fairweather, who understood the exact geography of a person's fear better than anyone Winifred had ever known, and who had spent 3 years teaching her, patiently, that every act of control was an act of love if you called it that with enough conviction. She told him about the winter she'd stopped writing to her sister in Regina because Edmund read the letters first, and about the doctor who set her fingers without comment, and about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by an entire town that knew and had collectively decided the knowing was enough, that decency stopped at knowledge and didn't require action. Rourke listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, turning something over. "A man like that doesn't stop because a stranger tells him to in a store," he said finally. "He'll come looking. Once the road's clear, I know. You have people. Somewhere that isn't here. My sister. In Regina." She hesitated. "It's a long way. Long way's not the same as no way." He looked at her directly then, which he rarely did, holding a conversation more often with his hands or the middle distance than with a person's eyes. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm telling you the door's not locked and it was never going to be. Whenever you're ready to walk through it, I'll ride as far as you need me to." She didn't answer that night. She lay awake a long time instead, turning his words over the way she'd once turned over every one of Edmund's, except that this time she wasn't searching for the trap in them. There wasn't one. That, more than anything else in 6 strange, quiet days, was what finally convinced her. Edmund Kestrel did come looking, and word of it reached the Cooley country before he did. The way word travels through ranching districts faster than any road allows, carried by a boy sent to buy tobacco, repeated by a neighbor who'd heard it from a neighbor. He'd been to the sheriff. He'd offered money for information. He'd told anyone who would listen that his wife had been taken, which was a word Winifred turned over with something close to bitter laughter, given what 3 years under his own roof had actually been. Sheriff Coburn, to his limited credit, was not entirely Edmund's man the way the sheriff of a smaller, more thoroughly bought county might have been. Stonebridge sat close enough to the rail line that a certain amount of outside scrutiny kept the local arrangements honest, or honest enough. But he was not going to ride out against Edmund Kestrel on the strength of rumor either, and so for a handful of days the situation held in an uneasy suspension. Edmund searching loudly, Winifred healing quietly, and the whole district watching to see which version of events would win. It was Prudence Fairweather, in the end, who forced the matter, arriving at the edge of Rourke's land with 2 of Edmund's hired men, and a story already prepared for anyone who might ask. That Mrs. Kestrel had suffered a nervous collapse and needed to be brought home for her own protection, that the man harboring her had taken advantage of a woman not in her right mind. It was, Winifred thought later, watching from the cabin window as Rourke walked out to meet them alone and unhurried, a remarkably good lie, built by someone who had spent 11 years perfecting the art of making cruelty sound like care. "She's welcome to tell Sheriff Coburn that herself," Rourke said when Prudence made her demand. "In town, in daylight. With Mrs. Ashby present to answer for herself. She is Mrs. Kestrel. She's told me otherwise, and I find I believe her account of her own name better than yours." It did not end peacefully in the way Winifred might once have hoped a story like this would end. One of the hired men, a broad, restless sort named Coulter, went for the pistol at his hip when it became clear Rourke wasn't going to hand her over, and there was a moment, brief, ugly, over almost as soon as it began, in which the man took a bullet through the shoulder for his trouble and dropped his weapon in the snow. And Prudence Fairweather's carefully prepared story collapsed into the much less flattering truth of armed men riding onto another man's land to take a woman against her will. It was that truth, told before Sheriff Coburn 3 days later with Coulter's wound as evidence no clever phrasing could talk around, that finally cracked the wall Stonebridge had spent 3 years building around Kestrel House. Edmund Kestrel did not go to prison. Men who hold half a county's mortgages rarely do, in a district built the way Stonebridge was built. But the marriage was done in every way that mattered. A lawyer from Regina, engaged on Winifred's behalf by a sister who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this letter, saw to that with a speed that suggested he'd been keeping the paperwork ready. Prudence Fairweather left the district before spring, and was not, as far as Winifred ever learned, much missed. And Winifred Ashby, she was already thinking of herself that way again, fully, without qualification, was, for the first time since she was 23 years old, answerable to no one's ledger but her own. She stayed through the thaw, not at the cabin, not at first. There was a decency to observe, and Rourke observed it without her having to ask, riding her instead to a widow's boarding house in town where she could recover her strength and her bearings without anyone having grounds to say a word about it. But she found reasons to be at the edge of his land often enough that by the time the coolies had gone from white to gray to the first tentative green, no one in Stonebridge was under any illusion about where matters stood, and no one this time seemed inclined to make trouble about it. They didn't talk much, on the rides out to check his lines or simply to put the season's first warm air on their faces after a winter that had nearly killed her twice over. She'd come to understand by then that this wasn't distance. It was the opposite of it. People with something to prove filled every silence they could get their hands on. She and Rourke had nothing left to prove to one another, and so the quiet between them sat easy. The way she imagined quiet was supposed to sit between two people who trusted each other. She thought sometimes on those rides about her father, dead 4 years now, unable to know what his arrangement for her had cost, unable to know either how it had finally ended. She thought he would have been sorry for the first thing and entirely unsurprised by the second. He'd always said she was the most stubborn thing he'd ever raised, and had meant it, on his better days, as something close to a compliment. She carried the missing of him differently now than she had at Kestrel House. Not a weight pressing down on her, but a weight she walked alongside, which she was slowly coming to understand was not at all the same thing. She didn't know yet, in that first green spring, exactly what she wanted her life to be built out of. But she was, for the first time since she was 23, in a position to ask the question at all without someone else's answer arriving before she'd finished forming it. She knew she wanted ground under her feet that was hers by her own choosing. She wanted to be spoken to, always in the tone one used for a person assumed to have a full mind and a right to use it. A standard so plain it embarrassed her a little that it had taken this long to name as a requirement rather than a hope. She wanted, on the bad nights that would still come, because she had stopped pretending they wouldn't, somewhere she could walk outside and stand under an enormous prairie sky and remember in her body and not just her head that the world was larger than any one house had ever let her believe. Rourke rode beside her most evenings and said little of any of this, which she'd come to understand was exactly right. He wasn't a man who needed to narrate his own steadiness. He simply offered it, the way he offered everything, without asking to be thanked for it. The coulee country opened out ahead of them in the long spring light, green climbing the slopes where the snow had been only weeks before, and somewhere behind her, smaller now and further off with every week that passed, was a gray stone house with a name she no longer answered to, and a town that had finally belatedly found the courage it should have found 3 winters sooner. She thought about all of it less and less as the season turned. What she thought about more was the ground ahead of her, unfamiliar and entirely her own to choose, and the particular unhurried company of a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she actually was. 3 years inside a house that called itself a marriage had been a long, hard chapter. It had not, she understood now, standing in the new grass with the whole width of the prairie sky overhead, been the entire book.